Welcome to One Time Radio. Today I am back finally on the podcast. It's been quite a while, and I figured, why not come back with the first guest I ever had on the podcast, Yugopnik. For those who remember, for those who've been listening for a while, know that Yugopnik was my first guest I ever had on One Time Radio for the podcast on liberal morality, Nietzsche, and Marx. Very entertaining podcast, still probably one of my favorites today. And I would say Yugopnik is one of my favorite people in the Marxist YouTube space for sure. One of the most genuine people. I highly recommend his videos if you don't know him already. I would like to actually get Yugopnik on for something that he knows very well. There's not a lot of discussion on YouTube when it comes to Yugoslavia. There's a lot when it comes to the USSR. So that's the subject of today, the Yugoslav experiment. So without further ado, before we get into, the weeds of Yugoslavia, Yugopnik, would you like to introduce yourself and, plug your stuff for those who don't know already?
Thank you very much. It's an absolute pleasure being here again. You run one of my favorite channels and one of the best shows through the Marxist lens that I've had the pleasure of listening to. And plus, you're a great person to hang out with and have great conversations with. Plugging, I'm on YouTube as Yugopnik, and I am also part of a 3-person team over at the Deprogram podcast. I'm a Balkan socialist, and I'm looking forward to this nice little conversation we will have this morning, evening, afternoon, depending on where our listeners are at.
Yeah, those who don't know the Deprogram, very entertaining podcast. Absolutely love it. Love all the people there, Hakeem, JT, Yugopnik, it's an amazing podcast. But yeah, so some of the listeners might not know exactly what the Balkans refers to, specifically. Obviously, they understand it's a part of East Europe. But maybe just for clarification for those who don't know, which countries are considered part of the Balkans? I'll off the top of my head, obviously, it would be countries that were in Yugoslavia as well as countries who were not, obviously the ones in Yugoslavia, Croatia, Serbia, Bosnia, Slovenia. I'm probably missing a few.
Fine. Yeah, Macedonia's on, but it's an extremely taboo question because Balkan people themselves fight with Balkan people on the definition of what is Balkan, as she likes to call it. Slovenians will say, oh no, we're much more sophisticated. It's southwards, those Croats, and then everybody underneath them that's actually Balkan. Then you talk to the Croatians, they're like, no, we're Catholics, we're part of the Western world. There's no way we can be from the Balkans. It's the Orthodox dirty motherfuckers down there, the Serbs and the Muslims over there in Bosnia. That's the Balkans. And it gets pushed down and down and down until, I don't know what, only Greece can be the Balkans. But basically, it's southeastern Europe, but it has a particular term given to it that some people relate to the mountain of Balkan, but it's a term that Balkan people have accepted and actually even celebrate to an extent, but originally a relatively derogatory one, which wanted to make sure that those Europeans that we're not really sure how European they are, have a separate name for them that is going to always define them as, yeah, sure, they're on the European continent, but they're not exactly Europeans. They're the people of the Balkans with their whole Balkanization, which most listeners probably know what that means, and ironically is a great representation of the region itself. But yes, if you ask me, it's everything from Slovenia and Hungary all the way down to
Hungary. I didn't know Hungary was considered part of the Balkans.
I do. I consider it. My little Asiatic hordes up there are one of us. I'm kidding, obviously, making fun of Hungarian racists, but all the way down to Greece. That's what I would define the Balkans.
Yeah, Greece, Bulgaria, and also Albania is also considered.
Yeah, and Romania,
Romania,
Montenegro, and then Macedonia or North Macedonia, depending on who you ask. Kosovo as a country or as a region of Serbia, depending on who you ask. Very fun. Probably we'll have a few new ones sprouting relatively soon. We'll see.
For those who didn't catch like Balkanization, I mean, it basically means like breaking up what is like a bigger country into a bunch of smaller countries based on like smaller or bigger cultural differences depending on who you ask, right?
Yep.
So yeah, moving onwards, I hear two kind of contradictory things about, people who live in former countries that were part of the former Yugoslavia. One is that there's a lot of Yugo nostalgia, like nostalgia for Tito, for, the Yugoslav system. And at the same time, I hear a lot that people in the Balkans are extremely right-wing, like more than, other places. To what extent are both of these true, or are either of them really true or exaggerated? Be very curious to hear like your firsthand experience on this.
So we don't have exact data on that can help us give our listeners a black and white truth on this. It's always like a subjective measurement, and in my opinion, the reason why the Balkans are that right-leaning and that reactionary, but only reactionary when it comes to their relationships with other Balkan states, not the Western definition of reactionary of just hatred towards, immigrants, people of color, etc., etc. Very warlike reactionary ideology is because of the insane amounts of money that have been invested in spreading said reactionary ideologies post-89, post-1990 in these countries in order to solidify the downfall of socialism, to solidify the new bourgeois rule of said countries, and to not allow socialists to come back through the front door in these now parliamentary, quote-unquote, democracies. So there has been an incredibly long, studious, and expensive attempt to completely eradicate any love or feeling towards feelings of love towards the Yugoslav Federation, and yet even through all of that active anti-Yugoslav propaganda, I believe that Yugo nostalgia is, as compared to how much was levied against it, still relatively alive. And as younger people are looking more and more towards left ideas because they did not grow up through a time when those left ideas have been completely spoiled to them by, as I said previously, propaganda, said Yugo nostalgia is going to be brought to the front door more and more, basically on the principles of class consciousness and of internationalism and international unity, at least on the Balkan Peninsula. But that's more of a analytical take. The more like direct take is the older a person is, the higher chance there will be for them to be Yugo nostalgic because they lived through that era. The younger they are, the higher chance you will find, the higher the chances that you will find somebody who is not really informed on what it was like then. The only thing they know is that, communists were plowing through fields and eating babies and burning churches. So you will end up hearing some very wild conspiratorial views on what Tito was like and what Yugoslavia was like in general. But almost every family, just like mine, is kind of split in the middle. I have grandparents that were proud socialists and missed Yugoslavia greatly. And then I have grandparents that, the communists came and took all the land from my father, blah, 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 that despised the Yugoslav experiment at its core. So society in general is pretty split from Croatia all the way down to Macedonia when it comes to Yugoslavia and Yugo nostalgia in general. But again, as younger people get into socialist ideas more and more, said Yugo nostalgia is going to grow.
Mm-hmm. So moving onward, I definitely want to get into, I would say, the crux of the podcast and probably what a lot of people are very, very interested in, and that is the main differences between Yugoslavia's socio-political system and the USSR. What I find particularly interesting is how even in the West, there tends to be, I would say, less reluctance to kind of praise the Yugoslav model while, shitting on the USSR, disregarding it entirely. Probably a byproduct of the Cold War because, interestingly, Yugoslavia, obviously was not aligned with either the USA or the USSR. They're part of the non-aligned movement, which put them in a kind of ambiguous place, which I would say shielded made them less propagandized against, suffering less propaganda like the USSR did from the USA, but also a lot of people just don't know anything about the Yugoslav model. A lot of people who at least weren't alive during the time don't even know Yugoslavia was socialist, right? So it is an interesting topic of discussion because people tend to think all actually existing socialism had the same systems, it was all the same, tried, failed, whatever, So I think this will be of a lot of educational value to listeners, and for the listeners who want to explain the stuff to parents, friends, or whatever who are curious about the history of socialism. So what were the main differences between Yugoslavia's system and the USSR?
No, okay, great question. Very, very expansive, but I'll try to keep it short and understandable and bite-sized so that it doesn't just, come in from one ear and exit through another. So,
Sure.
Yugoslavia attempted to create a international federation of multiple states, which have been added on top of what was previously defined as the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. So it was already monarchist, but already a relative international project even before it got melted over into the Yugoslav Socialist Republic versus the Russian Empire, then freeing some of its colonies and then integrating them into the Soviet Union as separate republics. So already there we're seeing certain differences. The Tito-Stalin split is a conversation for another time, but it led also to Yugoslavia defining itself as a neutral country in the newly ensuing Cold War, together with a lot of other both socialist but also anti-imperialist states. They founded the non-alignment movement, which allowed them to basically say, hey, motherfuckers, we are trying to do our little experiments over here. You guys sure do your experiments over there, but we do not want to be a part of this very violent and very, very intense game of whose dick is bigger, which was, in my opinion, what the Cold War in general was, initiated by the United States, needs to be mentioned, but it turned into a just regular dick measuring contest afterwards. And as such, Yugoslavia in the non-alignment movement can be best explained, I guess, the logic of it through one particular example. While both the United States and the Soviet Union were fighting on who can flex harder by reaching the stars, etc., which was a great project, but at one point it became, we're not doing this because we want to touch the stars, but because we want to be faster than the other guy. The Yugoslavs had their own space program that they've developed to a certain point, but they realized that the amount of money that is being invested in this is absolutely fucking ridiculous. And then what did they do? They sabotaged half of it and sold it to the Americans for, I think, like 6 yearly GDP budgets of Yugoslavia, and I think 1 full year of GDP of the United States, putting basically the idea of building whatever little experiment they were trying to build first, the standards of its population first, instead of this rat race, which was the Cold War. Now, some person might hear this and say, what the fuck are you talking about? The Soviet Union did not have a choice but to participate in the Cold War because it was actively being sabotaged all the way since the Bolshevik Revolution, but especially after World War II by Western superpowers. And yes, I would completely agree, and that is why we should not compare the reasons why the Soviet Union was in the Cold War and why Yugoslavia chose to be outside of the Cold War. But in the same way, I do not see historically based reasons on why a pro-Soviet individual could criticize Yugoslavia for choosing its neutrality. It had the option for neutrality and it chose it, and it showed in the economy of the country. They positioned themselves between the East and the West, very often getting lots of treats from both of them that because they continuously because they continuously try to push them to one side or the other, which then leads us to, I guess, the crux of the matter. How did the system, particularly, we talked about the position in the international sphere, how the federation was created, and now we can touch on what the actual systematic structure was. The Yugoslav socialist model was pretty different to that of state planning, which was the main direction the Soviet Union went in. Yugoslavia wanted to make absolutely sure that all of the individual regions still have as much independence over their own industries as possible. The Soviet Union also did this, but in Yugoslavia, the structures which control particular industries in all of the individual republics became their own entities of smaller state planning, if we can call it that. This is called worker self-management, where basically instead of one core giving orders to multiple different industries that then give orders to people who parts offset industry, enterprises, etc. Here, all industries had their own independent councils, which basically managed them, which then allowed for individual enterprises to also have independent councils, which managed them, etc. This led to the big minus, which was a relatively high unemployment rate, especially for a socialist country, because at one point these workers' councils kind of ended up competing amongst each other. When you're competing amongst each other, you cannot really afford to hire and hire, because why? Because you're gonna you're gonna be making less money that you can then reinvest in your not-for-profit enterprise, versus where the completely top-down approach of the Soviet Union could just say, no, you have to employ these people, and you will employ these people, and you will find them a job. So it led to relatively higher unemployment rates, but as compared to, for example, the Soviet Union, it led to a lot more consumer goods being created. You were not lacking for a nice pair of jeans, or that soda pop, or 500 different types of sneakers, which to some people are more important than heavy industry. To others they are not. It also allowed for a smoother transition after the beginning of the Yugoslav socialist project after World War II, which did not have to as intensively nationalize land and remove previous class entities, if we can call it that were no longer welcome in this new socialist system. But it allowed itself a kind of pro bono period for those people to readjust themselves to the socialist superstructure, instead of just forcing them into they were forced into the socialist superstructure, but they were given a bit more time, let's just say that. So basically the difference is the Soviet Union state-run economy, where yes, in all the different federative republics you had some relative independence, but it was completely top-down. In Yugoslavia, while also being top-down, it wasn't coming just from one spot, but all of the individual industries had their individual workers' councils, which then had other enterprises underneath them, which also had workers' councils, where you would elect a leader, and they would then represent you in the larger workers' council, that would then choose a leader that represents them in the big worker council, instead of the other way around, the way it was in the Soviet Union. And also which led, again, we mentioned 12 to 13% unemployment rate, between 10 and 14 usually it was, which led to certain, let's call them, so we don't go too much into detail, holes in the yearly budgets, the quarterly budgets, which then led Yugoslavia to the necessity, to the need to take out loans. The USSR didn't need to take out loans, nor could they get loans from anybody, even if they wanted to. But Yugoslavia, because it was a relatively neutral country in the Cold War, was very politely approached by the IMF and made the mistake of actually trying to fix their socialist economy by taking loans from the World Bank, which was not just a shot in the foot, but direct cutting of one's whole ligaments. But I wasn't there. I can't exactly blame them, but now in retrospect, everybody's always smart, and in retrospect, it was a very, very stupid move. But so yeah, that's basically a bundled up explanation of the main differences between the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia.
Yeah, the IMF is like a whole topic of its own, like that and the Tito-Stalin split. We might come back to that real briefly, but just to clarify, so for the audience, so basically, like Yugoslavia had a system of workers' self-management, correct? Whereby essentially, instead of having just the difference with like a public sector replacing a private sector, whereby which involves like the abolition of private property, right? But it's like you still have like a hierarchical managerial system. Whereas in Yugoslavia, it was like enterprises primarily, run by workers themselves. Would this be considered private property, but in like a socialist way, or how? Because it seems kind of like a debatable as to whether it's like it wouldn't be private property in a Marxist sense because it's not capital. It's not using it to exploit others, but it isn't public property either. So like how would one see that exactly as like a worker because it's not just like worker cooperatives, right?
It's worker cooperatives, but at a more advanced stage. We don't really have a word for it. It's what was supposed to be right in the middle between the private and the public good. The Yugoslav experiment basically took a step back from what was supposed to be the first step of complete nationalization. They took it a step back and they created this workers' democracy or whatever, worker co-op type of economy where you have this thing which can neither be defined as a capitalist enterprise or a socialist enterprise, and we don't really have a word for it. And it existed as such. And it was a relatively decent attempt at an experiment of let's try and do it this way. We have many other socialist experiments that were radically different to the big daddy Soviet one, which I am very happy were tried because now we know what works, what doesn't work, etc., etc. And the Yugoslavs tried their own thing. And it ended up, having big pluses, big minuses, which the socialists of the future will hopefully learn from and adapt to their own set experiments. But having a specific term of what it is, even though it's very hotly debated, I think is a waste of time because it needs a word of its own to define it. It's neither this or that, if you get my point.
Okay, yeah, it is. It is an interesting topic of discussion. Another thing, correct me if I'm wrong, like the system politically of the USSR was also more quote-unquote decentralized in the sense that it went from being one party, right, the Yugoslav Communist Party, to then breaking up into multiple communist parties in Croatia, Serbia, etc., right? So was it like, did each of the regions end up kind of running their own different policies with different parties? And if so, when did that happen? Like, was it...
So that's basically the main topic that interests most people. How did Yugoslavia fall apart? Because I cannot answer this question that you just answered without relating it to that particular thing. Many different theorists, historians, and so on find the real reason why the country fell apart in many different places. But to me, the beginning of the downfall after the death of Tito was basically allowing for new festering bourgeois interests to start erupting in all of the individual republics of the country, which could only happen thanks to the relative independence of their own local party structures that then began competing against local party structures of the other republics. The second that kind of playing field was given to basically traitors to the cause, they started using their local party structures as a system to, as a tool to saw division among the republics and to continuously talk about how one republic is leeching off the other, how we need more funding because those motherfuckers over there are getting funding. It basically led to it set the material ground for the republics to start thinking that they are supposed to be competing amongst each other, which then later on allowed for again the newly festering bourgeois pest to use said local regional party structures to then start nationalist rhetoric and then eventually lead up to the breakup of the country. Obviously, all of that helped by the good old United States, which no longer needed a neutral player right in the middle between the Soviet Union and Germany, because the Soviet Union no longer existed, combined with obviously the now newly emerging pre-World War II right-wing ideologies, which were reintroduced to the front door to the population as the main lie/reason on why we now need to fight our local neighbors. But one could argue that none of this would have happened if the party power wasn't kept more centralized in the first place, which Tito managed to do, but later on, rarely which political figure could afford without kind of ironically leading to division. So in order to avoid division, we gave potential reactionaries more power, who then used it to sow even more division, kind of the snake eating its own ass thing.
Yeah, I've heard that discussed before, like the debate as to how much breaking up the parties in a decentralized way to have one for each region, whether that contribute to the collapse, because it is like a popular sort of way of thinking among the left today, liberals, as well as libertarians, that decentralization is always preferable to centralization. It's a question I've thought a lot about these past couple of years, kind of rethinking.
No, to me, decentralization is great, but you cannot first create it as a very centralized thing, and then you start radically decentralizing it, because it inspires competition amongst the decentralized structures that you've created. You either start with one and you stick with it, or if you then are starting to slowly reform it or change it, do it through a much longer period of time, not fucking half a decade the way it was done in Yugoslavia.
Right, yeah. I more so mean is because there tends to be an assumption that decentralization equals democratization. Like, a lot of people just think that, if you break up power, you have a balance of powers, it's more democratic. But, I mean, not necessarily, because if they're governed in the same way and you just break them up into more of them, I mean, that separates power, but that doesn't really create more democracy. It might separate power among elites, but it doesn't really give necessarily...
Which is what happened, exactly.
Yeah, because it's like, I mean, Khrushchev, right, like experimented with decentralized economic reforms, kind of trying to decentralize production, which visibly failed, like in the sense that they were reversed because they didn't lead to crop yields. They were reversed under Brezhnev. Because it was assumed that, part of what maybe was a problem with the Soviet planning was that it was too static, too central. But I think if we look at the history of like Soviet planning, if anything, it's more to do with the lack of transparency and the lack of data, the sheer the sheer technological limits of data computation to be able to construct plans that would incorporate like varying aspects of behavior and all of that.
Product of its time, yeah.
A product of its time, and I mean it's also it's like it's more than just whether it's top down or So I mean that's a whole different debate of its own. But I do find it interesting because there is a lot of popularity today when it comes to market socialism. I think the idea of market socialism, obviously often associated with the Yugoslav model, the idea that essentially like the socialist programs that are often in social democratic countries are fine, and we even want like workers' ownership of the means of production. But obviously because of the sort of obviously they had their massive successes, but ultimately all the socialist experiments kind of also ended up failing in the grand scheme of things, depending on how you look at it. So there's a lot of like disdain towards the Soviet model, especially because of the lack of consumer goods and variety when it came to, I guess, novelty. It's a complaint I've seen people who lived in the former East Germany, especially, is like the lack of just the fact that everything was owned by the government, everything was gray. So I think people are attracted to this idea of like markets maybe aren't bad under socialism. So, and if we have people own the means of production, but still engage in kind of commodity production and trade it on a market, as long as there's no extraction.
Because it's all they know. It's all they know. The way the market functions, the way the market drives the economy is the only thing that people in their living life have actually managed to experience. So the radicality of revolution and a complete switch of systems is too scary. So they need something in the middle, which was literally like Yugoslav logic. We need something in the middle, so let's do this market socialism thing. Let's leave the enterprise, blah blah blah. What we talked about. It's understandable for why one does it, but is it sustainable? That can be a whole debate.
Well, that's kind of what I was going to ask leading up to that, because obviously the idea of market socialism is, I would say, partially popularized by Richard Wolff. People like Richard Wolff who kind of popularized co-ops in general as well. Although in Wolff's defense, Wolff does believe in like a role for economic planning, state planning. So he's not like it's not a binary between markets and planning. He sees a role for both to an extent. But what is your opinion more generally on the kind of resurgence of market socialism? And as someone who has knowledge of the fact that in a sense market socialism was tried in Yugoslavia, what are the pros and cons of that?
History never exists in a vacuum, right? So we cannot say if market socialism was completely successful or complete failure by looking at Yugoslavia, because Yugoslavia existed at that particular period of time and it was basically destroyed as a consequence of its surroundings as much as its internal discomforting contradictions. So if we look at one particular example to explain if a particular ideological approach worked or didn't, would be kind of unscientific. But from the perspective of if you want to achieve A and you have approach B, C, D, E, F, G, and then just for rhetoric's sake, we sit down and we start comparing the logic behind why we should take A, B, C, D, E, F in order to reach A path, one could come to the conclusion that while market socialism is the most comforting thing that we can offer people that are looking towards the left from a more radical position than just a typical social democrat, while it's would be the best PR move, while it would be the most acceptable sort of thing that we can sell socialism through, which I believe is most of Dr. Wolff's logic to an extent, in my modest opinion, it would not necessarily be enough because of my own subjective personal opinions towards the market, which I see as this insanely hungry commodifying force that is doing the majority of the damage which capitalism in general does on society. Play Joker theme. So that's why I think that you get what I'm saying. Yeah.
Yeah, like, no, of course. I mean, I think one of the most obvious consequences of markets, like, I mean, we should clarify before that, like, markets are not inherently capitalist. They obviously predate capitalism by a long time, but that doesn't mean they're not without their issue, right? Because, like, the whole point of communism, like the project of striving towards communism, is obviously it's a very long project of going far beyond the capitalist logics. And although markets are not, they predate capitalism, it is a logic we should, try to transcend at some point. I would say I'm much more on the cautionary end of, like, skeptical as to how we do that, because I think attempts that have tried to repress markets too much kind of pretty much all failed. Yeah, they either led into, like, massive food shortages, or in many cases this didn't work in the sense that you had markets anyway operating as black markets. Like in most, I would say, Soviet countries that with the Soviet system, black markets existed, and I got to a certain point that under, like, the late Brezhnev years, they just let them exist because they're meeting the demands of people faster, like, who were willing to pay more, right? But that's the thing, willing to pay more. We can see the problem with markets right away is that it's a kind of uneven distribution of resources that will always, especially, I think, would be not very effective for essential resources. Like, if COVID has told us anything, is like markets really, or climate change, issues like this, that there isn't a profit incentive. Markets are very bad at meeting such demands. So I think we do need to look towards a form of planning, but we really need to study how, for example, like a cybernetic form of planning would work, like, rigorously. I mean, there is obviously work on this, but, like, it still needs to be tried. Obviously, Allende tried, and he was cooed by the United States, and the Soviet Union. Many people in the Soviet Union wanted to try it, but the bureaucracy was far too overbearing in the Brezhnev era. That they were actually, like, such a project scared them because it would lead to the transparency of information. So the OGAS, the project it's called, was heavily repressed. But yeah, I can see the appeal of the Yugoslav system, and one, because it's it has been tried, even though it has, like, flaws, as you mentioned. But it is, like, the idea of just owning one's labor, the idea of being able to self-manage in the workplace is just sounds way less alienating than most of the jobs, like, we're accustomed to in the capitalist world. So I can totally see the appeal. But I mean, I would want to dig a little deeper into regards with Yugoslavia specifically. In what ways did market socialism make the system a little bit better than the Soviet Union? In what ways did it make it worse? Because I can think of some. In my head that I've heard, but you know this subject more than I do. So
go give your examples, and we'll go from there.
Okay. Well, I mean, I have heard that. Well, for one, okay, and this has less to do with market socialism and more just to do with the kind of slightly more liberal nature of Yugoslavia, is that you could travel which in a lot in East Germany, it was very, very difficult to get out the country. You would have to get approval before doing so. In the Soviet Union too, obviously pre-Gorbachev, you had to get an approval to travel. And most of the time, you could travel only to specific other countries that were part of the Warsaw Pact. So I do hear that as, like, a thing why the system was better. But with regards to market socialism, I have heard a comparison that, like, consumer life was better in in Yugoslavia compared to the likes of the USSR and East Germany, the DDR. That, like, you had, because it was worker self-management, you had restaurants where people were much more put, like, in I guess this is what I've heard, so this is not me saying, like, this is a fact. I mean, the whole concept of why, like, against, like, state ownership of everything is that when a group of people are part of own a business, right? they are more likely to actually put their effort into it and kind of care about it than if it's like a state public property. So you'll have more, I guess, creative industries flourish. So maybe in that way you could say like Yugoslavia was just, yes, less boring than a country like the DDR in USSR. I don't know how much that's true, but it is something I have heard frequently as a comparison. And I guess if you're curious about like what I would think of the cons, I've heard Yugoslavia was significantly more corrupt than the USSR, although USSR was also had a lot of corruption. And I guess maybe that has to do with markets, because if you have like a market society, it's very easy for people to get rich and get richer relative to others and have more power and influence.
You wouldn't call it a bourgeois, but you would call it like the guy that always gets elected by the worker council to be the director, right? And at some point he would get elected so many times that he would accrue maybe not financial but influential power over middle management and over the employees, which would then the employees would get some additional benefits if they kept electing the same guy. So he indirectly, even though he was not the owner of the company or the CEO of the company, he ended up basically being the CEO of the company. Just he gets reelected every single year or every single quarter, depending on how that particular enterprise did it. So you end up still having like a class structure there. You just you call it something different, and people would say, oh, but he didn't actually own the company. Well, okay, he didn't own it on paper, but for 15 years he kept getting elected as the only person who can say how the capital and the means of production are going to be used, offset enterprise. So is he really not the owner? All those points can be made and they can absolutely be logical. But then
at least they're elected though. Like, I mean, the only people who get elected in capitalist enterprises is like the CEO, the shareholders are only people who elect, right? So,
and there were many cases where such quote unquote directors were inspected by the state or were kind of had many overthrows inside of the enterprise itself by unhappy workers and so on. Yugoslavia constantly listened to any mass protest. It can actually proudly say about itself as compared to, for example, the Soviet experiment, that almost no mass protests were put down violently. One famous one was the student protest of basically, you guys, promised us a certain type of socialism and you're not delivering. That's basically what they were about. Tito went out on TV and said, okay, if young people are saying this, then there's something fucking wrong. Let's do some fucking reforms. Let's see what the fuck is going on, etc., etc. It allowed a lot more flexibility. It allowed for a lot more social liberal attitudes, because it was genuinely an international project where not any individual state's culture was more important than everything else. While in the Soviet Union, we could say to an extent, even though it did incredible things when it comes to fighting racism, fighting hatred towards different minority groups, etc., but just because of the size of it, was mostly a Russian-led project, because it happened to be a majority Russian population country. Yugoslavia proactively fought against that, and a lot of Serbs, for example, give it shit because the Serbian population would have been the absolutely dominant one, because that's just, there's more Serbs. Serbia was cut basically, what is called traditional Serbia was basically cut on the north in a different mini federation, so don't complicate it too much for the viewers, was created, and then in the south another mini federation. So basically Serbia was cut into three federations, so that it doesn't have too much voting power as just one of the entities, etc., etc. It allowed for more social liberalism. It allowed for more proper, true internationalism inside of the state, and because of its position In the Non-Alignment Pact, it allowed for citizens to basically travel from Japan to New York. You could go to Moscow and you could go to New York as a Yugoslav, which was absolutely fucking wild at the time, and actually up until today. I don't think there's any passport, arguably, that's ever been better than the Yugoslav one. When we're talking about countries with more than 100,000 people. So it allowed for a lot of things, but just the contradiction of the 10 to 15% unemployment rate, the contradiction of the IMF loans, the contradictions of the cutting up of the of party power to the different republics, the contradiction of allowing inter-republic competition, etc., led to its eventual downfall. But would that downfall have happened if it didn't exist in such a hostile, in this case, both in the Cold War and post-Cold War environment? What ifs are fun but not really material. I would argue, just for fun's sakes, maybe not. If the Soviet Union had won the Cold War, would Yugoslavia have fallen apart? Maybe not. But as it stands now, the Yugoslav experiment can be a very hopeful, very naive, very innocent, but yet, for what it attempted to do, in my opinion, successful project that Socialists of the Future can look back upon and see that the path to revolution can have a much softer hand from time to time, and it shouldn't feel like that said softness is going to always lead to loss.
Right, that's very well worded. It is I think it's also hopeful because it shows the diversity of socialism, right? That socialism is not a monolith. There's been multiple ways it's been tried, and there's pros and cons and contradictions to these different systems. I am curious though, because you mentioned the IMF, like Yugoslavia taking loans from the IMF, which I believe was to actually, like, they're borrowing US dollars to go purchase US consumer goods, which I think that's part of it, right?
Mm-hmm, yep.
Which I find a little bit strange, because you'd think that having a market system would allow Yugoslavia to develop its own consumer industry that's very good, making it better than like the likes of the USSR. But the fact that they would still have to borrow money to get US consumer goods suggests that maybe a market system doesn't necessarily lead to like that great of a consumer life. And even so, what even is a good consumer life? Because
exactly, that's
like
exactly
it could just be branding, as you know, like
but that's exactly it. It no matter how good the Yugoslav jeans are, it doesn't say Levi's on them. It bought into arguably, I would argue, like, Yugoslavia was so fucking brainwashed, the average Yugoslav citizen, by very, very good Western advertising. Branding was the fucking shit. And that's why, again, no matter how good the local genes are, you want the ones from the West. The people start complaining, and the government has to basically do something about it, because not the people start complaining. Literally, the market starts demanding it. People are like, the second any Western shop opens, everything's fucking bought out immediately, because advertising worked on these poor little innocent socialists that actually believed when a cowboy is wearing the Levi's and riding a horse, and they aren't fucking stretching at all, that they actually must be better. A funny thing, actually, because to this day, I know it's all over the world, but especially in the Balkans, like the belief that the quality of brand equals price of said brand, luxury of said brand, is so fucking prevalent here that you will talk to like the most brilliant person ever who, for example, will not touch something unless it's from a brand that everybody knows, because they, not necessarily just because they want to flex with it, but because they think it's subjectively better. And that's, again, another thing that's a leftover of this feeling of inferiority. Like, even though we have these products that we're creating with minimal cruelty towards workers, with actual worker ownership, etc., without any exploitation, just a sense of inferiority towards, be it Western products, Western culture, etc., led us down a path of wanting to be more like the Westerner. And now, some Mannersen are driving around in Porsches, but the rest are still in their beat-up fucking Yugos, living in buildings that the socialists made that no fucking capitalist even has the money to paint. It's the irony of history never ceases to amaze.
Yeah, I mean, Che Guevara sort of warned against that in his book Economics and the Transition to Socialism, I believe, or it's not his book. It's Helen Yaff's book about Che Guevara and his ideas and the writings on like the transition to socialism. But he has something where he talks about like the debate as to like fostering a consumer industry and stuff like that. And the issue is like if you foster that mentality of like, consumerism and whatnots, you can easily like. More is never enough. That's the thing. Is like socialism cannot really beat capitalism on capitalism's terms, because like capitalism, I don't think there will be a better system than capitalism, like ever in history than like at branding, because capitalism is good at like basically capitalism exists on essentially having a carrot on the stick to perpetually stimulate your desire. So more is never enough. So like you can have like a great like I heard the stories about how a lot of like when the Soviet Union really tried to like boost a consumer industry under Khrushchev, and it kind of continued actually afterwards too, through state planning, like apparently like they had to like throw out so many like wooden toys because when people discovered like Western like like Western more like I guess like shiny toys, like the others didn't look cool. So it's like if you create this mentality where people think in this way, it's nothing is enough, so it's kind of like a futile effort anyways. So why even like actually there's a very interesting quote, I think it's either from Nixon or his ambassador, but it comes from his autobiography, but there's a quote basically that like what single-handedly like led to it's a joke, but there's some like little truth to it, but it's a joke.
That like coffee brands, yeah, it's good.
Yeah, was that like, well, I'm thinking of the quote where it says like what single-handedly led to started the collapse of the USSR was bringing Pepsi was when Khrushchev allowed Pepsi into the USSR. It was one of the first like US brands, because obviously Pizza Hut under Gorbachev, and then there was a couple before that, McDonald's after the fall, but like Pepsi was actually allowed in under Khrushchev. And it's like
there was East Berlin political figure. I don't know exactly who he was, but has a similar quote. We did not lose because we were wrong. We lost because we didn't have enough brands of coffee.
Yeah, I heard that actually spawned like one of the biggest protests. Was like I'm not sure if it was there was a shortage of coffee, I believe, like in East Germany, and like so like I think socialism should prevent like shortages. We should have like somewhat of an abundance, but like this whole branding, like we can't compete on capitalism's terms. I think that is,
and we shouldn't, but we should also not completely disregard the love people have towards shiny little things that they want in their household, which is what a lot of the socialist experiments try to do. They were like, this is not for us, this is even, sometimes social consider this is for the degenerates, this is for but let's ignore that. We should not compete with them, but we should not completely ignore it, because then you have a situation where you're making wooden toys in like 65 for people, if you get what I'm saying. Like, people need to experience some levels of consumer joy, if we can call it that, so that they get over it. But if you never got to get a new flashy thing, you don't know what it feels like, so you overhype it in your mind. And then at that exact same time, the Western guy comes and he's like, oh man, we have so many nice and flashy things. So you're obviously going to want the thing that you cannot have. So again, we should not compete with the capitalists, but we should also not say you cannot have this, because that it's going to be the only thing people end up caring about. Exploit me, but just give me a more diverse choice of genes.
What's that meme where it's like the Hezbollah guy? Or no, it wasn't him. It was like whatever, some like Eastern European kid eating a burger. Burger, yeah.
Burger.
It's like that's like what you get after the fall. It's like after the fall of communism. It's like you get Burger King and McDonald's. It's like fucking exciting. Yeah.
The big joke in one of the Balkan countries, because I've been all over them, is back in the day, we had everything, but we didn't have bananas. So we really wanted bananas. And now we don't have anything, but we have bananas everywhere. Bananas being like, for some reason, it was really difficult to get bananas. And only like party officials would have bananas at home. And bananas became kind of like the fanciest thing you can do. You go and you give your kid like a banana when they go to high school and they eat a banana. And it was like, oh my God, this guy's like obviously high up in our beautiful socialist republic. And you get what I'm saying. A banana explaining the need for people to differentiate themselves from each other through consumption, exemplified by a banana.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense because like part of why like especially Western countries have such access to like the diversity of like fresh fruits and vegetables and all this stuff is because we have like the tropical countries under the grip of imperialism.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, like Guatemala coup literally happened basically over fruit.
But that's exactly why you need to give people bananas, so they try bananas, and then they're like, okay, bananas aren't that's fucking okay. Bananas are okay, but then you tell them after they've tried bananas, in order for you to get these bananas as much as you get them, we need to basically enslave whole fucking countries. Then that banana stops tasting that well. But when you've never tried a banana, and they tell you, man, we will have to enslave whole countries in order to get you that banana, you'll say, fuck those motherfuckers, give me some bananas. Because you don't know how average a banana is. I don't know if I'm putting myself across here properly. But that was always something in the back of the head of most Soviet citizens, Yugoslav citizens, or whatever. Like, they didn't appreciate the worker self-management or worker democracy, call it whatever, that they had locally, because they didn't have what to compare it to. And the other shit was very, very flashy. This was very theoretical, very like, oh, my rights or whatever. But the other shit's flashy. And when you put something shiny in front of a toddler and a fucking manuscript, what the fuck do you think they're gonna go towards?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I mean, like if Latin America went socialist, socialist countries like in a world of socialist internationalism.
Absolutely,
we could get bananas. It would just be a little bit expensive. It would just be a little bit more expensive. That's the only difference, right?
That's
But before we end this one, because it's already over an hour, I just have like two remaining little questions because that we alluded to, because we alluded to them. So like, I mean, I know the people want to know. Okay. So, like, you briefly referenced it. Thoughts on the Tito-Stalin split?
It's bad when bros don't get along. Because his name was Josip Broz Tito. I will leave it at that.
The best name ever.
Yeah.
I mean, we could look at the different perspectives. Like, I guess from my impression is that you could say there was a problem of like Russian Soviet chauvinism that where the USSR, like, yeah, I'll say Stalin, but like it wasn't just Stalin, it was really like the Soviet leadership as a whole, like wanted to kind of impose the Soviet model on its allies. I mean, that was a thing. Like it's
the Soviet Union imposing its model on its allies was one of the greatest socialist mistakes in history, in my personal opinion. The Soviet Union had no right or any business to tell the Bulgarians or the Romanians or the Polish or the Czechoslovakians how to do their own socialism. It is, I would never call that imperialism. It is not. But
yeah, it wasn't imperialism. It's just like chauvinism, I would say, like. Or some say social imperialism, like that's what Maoists say, but I don't like to even use the word imperialism, but maybe like chauvinism of some kind.
In that context, yeah, it really should not be used. But I'm not going to even dive deeper. It's idiotic. The only thing I will say that to this day, a lot of people just refer to the socialist period as the Russian period, or they call it the Russian occupation. It is very difficult to clean an era in history where you knew that whoever you did elect or whoever was in power in your own country, before they did anything, had to go and ask the guys in Moscow. So how can you feel like you were in an independent country when you knew that Ceausescu, whatever he needed to do, he needed to ask Moscow. Todor Zhivkov in Bulgaria, whatever he needed to do, he needed to ask Moscow. East Berlin, whatever they needed to, East Germany, sorry, whatever the DDR wanted to do, they needed to ask Moscow. How can you feel truly independent? How can you feel like you are in charge of your own destiny, socialist or otherwise? You cannot. You cannot. Because how can you listen to somebody preaching to you about how we are creating a new world in which there are no puppets and no masters, and that guy telling you that sits down and calls up Moscow to say he can even say that speech later? It was absolutely fucking idiotic. And Tito having the balls to say, no, I wish more guys had the balls to, honestly, to say no.
No, he was a very ballsy guy. Fucking smoked in the White House.
Yeah. A Cuban cigar in the White House.
Yeah, I mean, like, there is in the, like, obviously we do know, like, the system was pretty much, like, imposed not only on East Europe, but actually, like, there's not a lot of people discuss the kind of quasi so-called socialist experiments in Africa. You know, more happened after Stalin, more in the Khrushchev, Brezhnev era. But like a lot of kind of similar systems were imposed on countries that really did not have like the geopolitical or social.
Exporting revolution doesn't work.
I think we can export revolutions. We can't enforce how it's manifested. Like that's up to the people
I used the wrong
right?
term. Yes.
Yeah, I know what you mean.
You can export the ideology. You can motivate local structures to uprise, to educate, to agitate, etc., etc. But to like just you. For example, can you see like an invading force coming and telling somebody now you're socialist, and that government not being overthrown in like
I mean, that was
months?
Basically like the Red Army after World War II, right?
Yeah.
Which like that I can understand because some countries did like want to be liberated. It's just like more the imposition of the system. But yeah, like I mean, I can also think of like how there was. I mean, the thing it's like we can attribute it to Stalin, but it was also just like the Soviet leadership and in general, like really did have this problem. Like there is actually in the Soviet archives, like that were leaked after the fall, that actually Stalin had planned like as a backup plan if Mao was not in line to actually have him assassinated. Like if he did not like abide by the Comintern's plan, which is kind of an interesting, like, I really would wonder how some people would react to that because I do think this, and there's also which this is not proven, but I mean, it is a kind of sort of conspiracy among some. I don't know if you buy it or not, that Dimitrov was assassinated by the Soviets because Dimitrov, obviously the first Bulgarian socialist leader, communist leader, kind of wanted to, he flirted with joining the Balkan Federation, right? Like, which was the pre-Yugoslavia idea, right? Of a united Balkan Federation with Greece was supposed to be part of it too, right?
Mm-hmm.
If they would win the civil war.
No, but you talk to a typical Bulgarian, they're like, he was just an alcoholic, man, don't worry. That's why he died so suddenly. Not proven. It's literally a conspiracy theory, but you can't tell me guy wants better allyship between Bulgaria and Macedonia, and therefore with Tito's Yugoslavia, goes to Moscow, boom shakalaka, oh my god, dead. Right as they were supposed to start this quote-unquote Balkan Federation. Again, conspiracy, but if it ever turned out to not be a conspiracy, that would be, least to say, extremely disappointing in my eyes when it comes to my opinions on the other Josip, on Josif, not Josip, but Josif.
Right, yeah. I mean, that could tie into like the Tito-Stalin split in general, because I think the sort of domineering nature of the Soviet Union kind of made Tito and the Yugoslav leadership like hostile. So you could say that kind of aggravated it. But in many ways, to play like devil's advocate, I guess, like one could say the Yugoslavia, Tito especially, was very, let's just say, risky in his diplomacy with the USSR and aggravating tensions, right? Like in kind of sending assassins between each other. You could say the Soviets aggravated it, right? But I think in many ways, like there was, you would think that after Stalin there would be more like of an effort for Yugoslavia and the USSR to like rebuild ties, but I mean, they still remain non-aligned, right? And it's kind of
there's so much going on everywhere that was not in anyone's interest at that point, I guess. But a good so it doesn't sound like I'm just throwing anti-Soviet conspiracy theories here. A good anti-Yugoslav conspiracy theory is the split happened because of a secret pact between Tito and Western superpowers of creating this little markety socialism in the middle, like a tampon zone, which the West realistically understanding that the socialists won in all of Yugoslavia. World War II is ending now. We cannot completely remove this socialism thing that the partisans, the liberators have branded themselves with, but we also need to make sure you don't buddy with the Soviets. So a relatively decent deal was offered to them, so they can keep their independence, but also remain under the what's the English term, under the
boot
under the
influence,
under the influence, and under the only term out there was you would have to then become neutral, and we'll let you do your little revolution. We won't grease you, so it's a pretty decent conspiracy that I've heard, and I can see it happening, especially when you see Tito's death, and even the likes of Margaret Thatcher coming and bowing in front of his grave. You start thinking, okay, this is understand that everybody respected him, and she even said, there's no she doesn't like socialists, but this particular socialist is different, blah, blah, blah. Her and 100 other, sometimes even reactionary leaders that Tito managed to have good relationships with, kind of leads me to obviously not believing that conspiracy, but saying, okay, it's a relatively interesting, decent, 7 out of 10 conspiracy that I can abide by.
Yeah, it is. I can totally see that because of also his depiction in Western media. What's weird is if you look on Wikipedia, the term benevolent despot, which I always thought is a kind of weird term, because what differentiates a benevolent despot and a non so it's very arbitrary. It's basically this whoever was nice to the West, because you see on the benevolent despot, Tito is there alongside Lee Kuan Yew, which is Lee Kuan Yew, who's a leader of Singapore, not leftist at all. And then you have but then Castro is not considered a benevolent despot. So it's what makes Castro not a benevolent despot, but you have Tito. It's it's probably just.
In the beginning of our conversation, you were a lot of people don't even know it was a socialist experiment. That was. How the fuck can we sell the Soviet Union as the greatest evil that has ever existed in history, that we need to fight because they want to castrate Jesus, but then we're okay with these other socialists? You just, you always do in PR, you just don't talk about it. You talk about, Yugoslavia, great, Yugoslavia. No, you don't say great. You say, Yugoslavia exists over there. This is like a federaration. It's a nice little country with nice little beaches and nice little mountains in the Balkans. You just don't say they're socialist. You just don't. And that's what they did. If you look all at touristy advertising materials for go visit Yugoslavia for Americans or for French people or for Brits or whatever, it's they say all the good stuff, but then they just don't mention that it's a socialist place. And nobody even knew. In the West, they didn't even fucking know. And they were okay with it.
It's wild. I have a relative who went to Yugoslavia, when it still existed, and didn't know it was socialist. And when I told them, they were socialist, she was like, "What?"
There you go. There you go. I'm not pulling this stuff out of my own ass. There you go. I mean,
Which is I find pretty funny. Like, but obviously, while the USA, it was nice to them. They were nice to them up until when the Soviet Union fell, and obviously, they took, as soon as they got the chance, they went and intervened. Which kind of leads me to the final question, which I do not expect you to fully answer. And if so, you can maybe like point us to videos or sources or stuff where we can learn about this more. Speaking both for myself and listeners, but like, what were the main factors that led to the collapse of the of Yugoslavia? Because obviously it kind of ended right with the invasion of Kosovo, right? But like, obviously there were many factors leading up to this breakup, and you could say like the U.S. invasion was more of like a nail on the coffin. So like, yeah, I don't expect you, obviously, this is a monumental question, but it's an important one.
It absolutely is. Maybe some of the listeners have noticed it. My energy got super high up in the last like 30 minutes as compared to the previous 45. So I'm going to be like a super bullet train with this one. You have World War II. You have basically 5 different sides fighting over this particular piece of territory. A lot of them pro-monarchy, a lot of them pro-Nazi Germany in Croatia, a lot of them bordering Mujahideen in Bosnia, etc., etc. Who wins the war and ends up being arguably the only European state that self-liberated from the Nazis? The socialist partisans, which were made up of a lot of different ethnicities and nationalities, largest of them being the Serbs, with the second being Croats, and so on and so on. But a very international movement. They create this international state. And Tito, as some of the first steps, what does he need to do? He needs to remove as much right-wing and ultra-nationalist rhetoric and ideology out of the country, because it can, be born again very easily. Throughout our conversation here, we talked about Yugoslavia being a little bit softer than other places, and when it came to the removal of actual Nazis right after the war ended, they were everything but soft, But afterwards, when it comes to the complete annihilation of rhetoric, of right-wing rhetoric, of reactionary patriotism, etc., of all of the different republics, they were very soft. The work camps in Yugoslavia, all of them combined. I mean, the main one, Goli Otok, for example, where mostly nationalists were sent, I believe, didn't have over 5,000 people during its 15-year history. That's I don't know, a department in a typical American jail, right? So what I'm basically saying is that during Tito's era, right-wing rhetoric was stifled, but not completely rooted out of the country. This is going to be important for the later part of our conversation. So years pass, the economy develops very quickly, but then starts slowly falling because of the contradictions of market socialism as attempted in Yugoslavia particularly. That then leads to different new fledgling bourgeois interests being born in all of the separate republics of Yugoslavia. After the power vacuum of Tito was created, after he died, obviously, these fledgling bourgeois interests start spreading. They start entering official party rhetoric with the ideas of reformation, the ideas of introducing even more markets, the ideas of abandoning this now old and tired socialist idea, etc., etc. That is being sold to the people as these economic crises are going to be solved by us moving more westwards. But the main thing behind said rhetoric is the introduction of more liberalized markets individually into republics, so that these, as previously mentioned, fledgling bourgeois can increase their wealth. That wealth was exponentially increased, especially during the 80s. But like with all markets that have some relative reform, some relative restrictions on them, can grow only to a certain extent. That is when the now fledgling, no longer fledgling, but actually proper emerging bourgeois classes of Yugoslavia needed to completely 100% liberalize their individual economies. They were in direct competition between federation and other federation, inter-bourgeois competition, and they needed to grow. So what do? We introduce the rhetoric that at this point people thought was forgotten, but was definitely not forgotten, of their reactionary forefathers back in World War II. You start telling Croats they should be proud of their Ustasha grandparents. You tell Serbs that they should be proud of their Chetnik grandparents, and how their greatness has been destroyed by the evil communists. You tell the Bosnians that they deserve their independence after as descendants of the great Ottoman idea, versus these lowly Christians thinking that they can tell them what to do, or these communists telling them that they're supposed to be atheists. You basically reintroduced World War II animosities to a population which is in a horrible economic situation because it's just been going through almost a decade of relatively intense market liberalization. A population that no longer has the father figure of Tito present. And that whole little mess, combined with the West's absolute interest in the falling apart of, at that point, one of the strongest countries on the European continent, not the strongest, but the last even semi-socialist states on the European continent, leads to around 10 years of very intense inter-ethnic conflict, where absolutely every single now newly established state uses arguments that make sense for them internally on why they need to fight a just war against their neighbor, which leads to countless lives lost, but countless lives lost, and not only lives, but the complete ideological downfall of socialism in the Balkan Peninsula. Kind of a product of history and a product of imperialism, all bundled into one, leading to a powder keg, which wasn't even a powder keg, but a very strong beam up until that moment, into completely exploding. And it's we are now living with the results of a bunch of little banana republics, which, yes, have their thousands of years of beautiful history behind them as individual nationalities, but now being represented by banana republic apparatchik imbeciles who fight in little, what do you guys call that shit that you have where kids hang out, like sandboxes?
Yeah,
basically a massive sandbox of southeastern Europe, where we're just throwing shit at each other while having nothing to basically eat.
Very well put. I think I'm very happy with that answer. Like that's a lot. You went through like from the beginning to the end, and obviously there's plenty of other, like, we can't cover everything here. I mean, I guess is there any books you'd recommend on this subject? Is Michael Parenti's book on To Kill a Nation about Yugoslavia worth reading? Because
he it's worth reading, but with a grain of salt. He simplifies certain things a bit too much. Understandably, I get where he's coming from. I will send you a list so we don't bore them with me reading this out, that you can put in the description for anybody to use as a resource.
For sure. Yeah. So it's fantastic having you on, Yugopnik, my friend. It's always, great talking to you. And I really hope the listeners enjoyed, got something out of it. Definitely share it with your friends and family who definitely want to learn about the history of socialism. Please give it a thumbs up, share, and peace out. Thanks for coming on.
Bye-bye. Thank you for having me on.